Good morning and welcome back. So, here, what I'm going to do is make a brief contribution to my digression on science is not a smorgasbord. And the reason for wanting to do that is to just talk about one of the more important theories in the history of science. And, I think I said this earlier that theory is a word that, in principle, words at the end of the day are a matter of convention, what we mean by words. We have problems when different fields or different parts of human endeavor use words in different ways. And what I want to say is, although it's, I think, overly rigid on my part to say it this way, for me, aspirationally, the word theory is reserved for scientific hypotheses that have been confirmed. So, Newton's theory of universal gravitation, Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism, the theory of evolution, the germ theory of disease, the theory of quantum mechanics. We can keep on going down this path. And, the point of this is that our imaginations are very limited. Scientists that are Landau had some scheme for measuring the virtues of different scientists, and I'm not sure how worthwhile that is really, but he had a log scale, and you know Einstein and Newton would be up in some sense at the pinnacle, and I certainly could agree with that. But my reason for mentioning is, like, I realize that, scientifically I'm a nothing um, on that kind of scale. But what I want to say is that all of us, every one of us, has a limited scientific imagination, and I can prove that by telling you that people like Sadi Carnot, thought that heat was a fluid. That people like Lamarck ventured this hypothesis that we now ridicule, but I think inappropriately, and a hypothesis about usage of certain facets of our being, and those, for example, the canonical giraffe stretching its neck in order to reach some leaves, and then the offspring would inherit that. Well, what's wrong with that as an idea? Or alternatively, the notion of geocentric description of the solar system. What's wrong with that? For every practical purpose, one has this weird sense that the vault of the heavens rotates around us, and so, one has to. I want to keep going. I want to keep giving examples of our lack of imagination. One of my great heroes from the 19th century was Hendrik Lorentz. And, unfortunately, we know of him relatively little. We, in relativity, learn about the so called Lorentz transformation. But this was a profoundly impactful scientist. And, he never let go of the idea of the ether. And the reason for that is because, if you do elasticity of materials and you're interested in propagation of waves through a material, you need a medium through which things will propagate. And so Lorentz felt that there needed to be some sort of a medium for the propagation of electromagnetic disturbances, and that was the so-called ether. But what does it have to do with anything? Those are all scientific hypotheses. They all happen to not have stood the test of time, and hence there is no ether theory, because that hypothesis was found wanting. There is a germ theory of disease, and the reason it shows up in my Science is a Smorgasbord part of the course is because I want to point out that, living in a global pandemic and seeing the weirdness of denialism, I feel like, it's worthwhile to try to understand a little bit of something about how we came to this view, and why it is that doctors wash their hands. There's a very important story that I think all of us should heed, having to do with Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian doctor who really reduced the impact of childbed fever, I think it might have been called, when women would die during childbirth. This was in Budapest, and the idea was that doctors were going from dissecting cadavers straight to delivering babies, and people ridiculed him because he said, it's nothing more than just washing your hands. But, to me, the notion of volunteering to be operated on by a surgeon and nurses that are not wearing masks and didn't clean their hands is so outrageous as to be ridiculous. And it's just really especially poignant and ironic for me at this very moment, because some of you might even have noticed a week ago that my face was really swollen. And it turns out on Monday I need to get a root canal. Not that you need to hear my life history. It was always on my bucket list to get a root canal. I'd heard everyone talk about it. So last year I got one, and I liked it so much I decided I should get another. So anyway, more than a week ago I got a terrible toothache in the back of my mouth, and went to the dentist, and who's a friend of mine, and he said, yeah, you have a bad infection. And what happened is that it propagated up my face, and my face was really swollen, and we could actually see it in the x-ray, the mass where the bacteria were. And we had this discussion that 100 years ago I might actually not have made it from this infection. And I think that's just sort of a very concrete example of what I'm going to refer to as the germ theory of disease. So I will have a separate vignette about viruses shortly. So viruses are only one kind of pathogen, and I want to talk a little bit about how we came to know about pathogens, and in particular to articulate this notion of the germ theory of disease. So on the right-hand side, I just give you a sense of the scales of pathogens. It's kind of a lovely, weird figure, I guess. I remember as a kid being so freaked out by the notion of tapeworms being inside of people's bodies, having a sort of meter-long length scale. So my starting point for this discussion really is going to be the long and sad history of cholera. So cholera is a disease that I think there have been seven major pandemics, and the most recent version actually was very interesting, was in Haiti after the earthquake over the last, I don't remember when it was, 10, 15 years ago. And there, the aid workers that came from elsewhere, they actually brought cholera with them, and it had not been present in Haiti for maybe 100 years in any serious way. So, many of us watched the series Game of Thrones, and there was a guy in that called Jon Snow, but that's not the real Jon Snow. The real Jon Snow is the father of anesthesiology and epidemiology, and he was interested in the propagation of cholera, and in particular in London. And there was a leading hypothesis at the time, which was known as the miasma hypothesis. This is the idea that it was some sort of airborne thing, exactly like what we're suffering through at the moment, which is indeed an airborne, or I should say, one that propagates, that we breathe in. And he didn't like that, and the reason he didn't is that he noted that the initial symptoms it was diarrhea, whereas you would think that something that you breathed in might show up in the lungs first. And so there's this famous story. I'm not going to go into it. I just recommend that you take a look at Amazon, where you'll find several interesting books about Jon Snow. I've read them all. I find the story to be super interesting. And, it was a detective story. He basically went around and tried to figure out, he had a different hypothesis. His hypothesis was that it was waterborne. So he went around and tried to figure out where people were drinking their water from. And, as with most good scientific stories, there's some twist that just doesn't fit. So, what he did is, if you like, you can think of it as he made the Voronoi diagram. The way you would do that is you would take all the pumps shown in blue, you connect them by lines, and then you would bisect those lines with other lines, and that will lead to a polygon. And so the idea of that polygon is, in a way, to find all the people that died and what the pump of closest proximity was. And when I talk about outliers, there were certain situations that didn't make sense. For example, there was some woman and her family, and they all died from cholera, but they were not in the zone of influence of the pump that he ultimately diagnosed as being the cause. Well, it turned out that she apparently liked the taste of the water from that particular, the Broad Street or Broad Street pump better. There were also a bunch of men that actually were not struck by the cholera, but they lived in that zone, and they, it turned out, worked at some brewery where they were given free beer. There's various things like that. I think I'm giving a watered down version of it that's probably not historically accurate. The concept is what I want to get across. Any historian of science will tell you that any of the histories that I'm telling you are mythologies, and I think that that's true in general. we have a mythology, and then we have the complicated, weird narrative of how things actually occurred. So what Snow concluded is, shown here in this beautiful, interesting figure, which is that the water from the Thames is a monster soup. Of course, probably all of you know that Antony van Lievenhock, the Dutch amateur microscopist, he would send letters in Dutch off to the Royal Society explaining his various efforts. I think he was in Delft, where he would grab every substance he could think of. He looked at all the possible body fluids, exactly what you would think of. He took stuff from his mouth. He looked at sperm. He looked at urine. He looked at feces. He looked at water from the canals and so on. And what he found, the words he used for this was very many animalcules, very prettily a moving, is the way that he said it. And I think that's a fun expression. And the rise of the germ theory of disease in part follows on the heels of this rivalry between Pasteur, who was French, and Robert Koch, who was German, and their attempt to track down the cholera. So I think they first ended up in Egypt, and then they followed it elsewhere, like to India. And in the end, what they found was a crescent-shaped bacterium, which is called Vibrio cholera, and that was inferred to be the causative agent. And where I want to close this little discussion of the germ theory of disease is just to talk about the postulates that were laid down by Koch as a way to diagnose the causative agent. So the idea, I'm gonna do this in a cursory fashion, but the idea is that you see an animal that has, like the mouse that you see up there, that's died, and that you're able to actually culture the putative microorganism that caused this disease. It's isolated and grown in pure culture, and then the pure cultured version is injected into a mouse, for example, and it once again either kills or causes disease in that animal, and that can also be it can be re-isolated from the new experimental host. One of the insights of the last, let's say, 30 years from microbiology is that we're really bad at culturing microorganisms. So, in principle, it might not be that obvious that one could go about such a culturing, but for my purposes, the main thing that I want you to carry away is this idea that, with the advent of this example from cholera, Pasteur's work on rabies, as you're going to see, I'm going to comment elsewhere about the rise of our understanding of viruses. There was some confusion about the great influenza and whether or not it was caused by a bacterium or by a virus and so on. I would just say that, the germ theory of disease, to go back to my original figure, we actually have very good structural information about many pathogens. We have very good genomic information. I would put the germ theory of disease sort of at the same level of all of the other classic theories, where theory is not pejorative, it's a complement. That maybe is the difference between the common use in the vernacular that you'd find on the street and that we sometimes use in science, which is the vernacular on the street is, I have a theory as to why celebrity X did action Y. That's not a theory, or at least that's not a good way for us to use that word. I think a useful way for us to use that word in the context of science. Theory is reserved for scientific knowledge, which has left the realm of debate and entered into the realm of true, bankable, actionable knowledge. And so that's my little digression on the rise of the germ theory of disease. And what I'll do next is the story of how we came to know about viruses.